Welcome to today's current news. Today is Wednesday, March 27th, 2024. Today we will be listening to BBC, Lost Power, a Mayday call and the crash that brought down a Baltimore bridge. AP, here are the big hurdles to the global push to build up renewable energy. NPR, there's already a catastrophic hunger in Gaza. Who decides when to call it a famine? NPR, what is the new etiquette for tipping? NPR, what one horticulturist has to say about pesticide residue on produce. BBC, Lost Power, a Mayday call and the crash that brought down a Baltimore bridge.
It was early Tuesday morning when the disaster unfolded. A major bridge here in the US city of Baltimore was hit by a container ship and it collapsed. The ship appears to lose power. Its lights go out. There was then a mayday call issued and the police stopped traffic getting onto at least one side of the bridge.
It was a horrendous crash.
Yo! What the?
They pulled 2 people from the river, but another 6 remain unaccounted for. Now, those who went into the water are said to have been construction workers on the bridge, filling in potholes when it collapsed.
Based on the length of time that we've gone in this search, the extensive search efforts that we've put into it, the water temperature, that at this point we do not believe that we're going to find any of these individuals still alive.
And look at the destruction it's left in the water. It is the power of these images and the shock it's left here that has drawn global attention.
Our prayers are with everyone involved in this terrible accident. The people of Baltimore can count on us, though, to stick with them at every step of the way until the port is reopened and the bridge is rebuilt.
The port provided thousands of jobs for the community, and the bridge was part of the fabric of life for people in Baltimore.
By the time the crew of the Dolly, a massive 948-foot container ship, realized what was happening, it was already far too late. The vessel, at the very start of a 27-day journey from the port of Baltimore to Sri Lanka, completely lost power after leaving the port and was hurtling at speeds toward the city's iconic Francis Scott Key Bridge. It was the middle of the night, and the crew on board were pitched into further darkness when the ship's light suddenly went out. The vessel was dead. There was no electronics and, crucially, no engine power. They were adrift but powerless to stop what was happening. Multiple alarms rang out as the crew ran unsuccessful tests in a desperate attempt to fix the issue and regain power. The local pilot on board the vessel frantically gave orders, telling the crew to steer the rudder hard to port and drop anchor to keep it from drifting starboard. While the emergency generator is believed to have kicked in, the ship never regained the use of its engines. The pilots were left with no choice. Shortly before 1:40, they issued a mayday call warning the authorities what a collision was imminent. There's a ship approaching that has lost their steering. An official with the Maryland Transportation Authority can be heard saying in a radio traffic record not long after, "Until you've got that under control, we've got to stop all traffic." Maryland Governor Wes Moore later hailed the crew as heroes and said that their quick response saved lives because authorities were able to stop the flow of vehicle traffic onto the bridge in the 2 minutes between the call and the collision. It did not, however, stop what happened when the Dolly slammed into a concrete column on the 1.5-mile bridge, which quickly collapsed piece by piece into the dark, cold waters of the state Patapsco River. 6 people, all believed to be members of a road crew working on the bridge, are presumed dead due to the water temperature and time that has passed. The U.S. Coast Guard said that late evening on Tuesday that it had concluded the men had died and intended to suspend its massive search and rescue effort, which had been complicated by cold and cloudy weather. Local media had reported that 6 workers were citizens of Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. The BBC has not independently confirmed this and has contacted consular authorities for comment. All 22 crew on the ship were Indian. The country is a major player in the global seafaring industry. The dramatic destruction of the bridge, which opened 47 years ago, left many in the city, including Governor Moore, shaken. This is a place that is a normal commute route for 30,000 Marylanders every single day. To hear the word of the key bridge has collapsed is shocking. It's heartbreaking, Mr. Moore said at the news conference on Tuesday. For over 47 years, it is all we've known. What exactly led to the loss of power on board of the Dali remains unclear. Jennifer Homendy, the chair of the National Transportation Safety Board, said that investigators would now seek to examine data from a voyage data recorder. It's a critical piece of our investigation, she said, adding that for now, the probe remains about people. It's about families and addressing the needs of those that were impacted. As the sun rose over Baltimore on Tuesday morning, residents of the diverse and strongly working-class areas near the bridge expressed shock at the scene they woken up to. I felt it. The house shook. John Flansburgh, who lives near the water, told BBC, "Today is not going to be a good day. A lot of tragedy." Another area resident, Darlene Irwin, said that she first knew there was a problem when she heard a rumbling sound. Hours later, the scale of the destruction became apparent when she looked out her window at the Patapsco River. The massive cargo ship carrying at least 3,000 containers was wedged between the debris of the collapsed bridge. By then, the entire area had become the scene of a massive search and rescue effort, with the police boat crisscrossing the river and the police and Coast Guard helicopters flying overhead. At a local school, 2 U.S. military UH-60 Black Hawk helicopters were parked in a sports field, their camouflage-clad pilots and crew milling next to the aircraft. To see it now in the daylight, Ms. Irwin said, it is just tragic. While officials have repeatedly stressed that their focus remains on the search for the missing, experts have warned that the incident could have a significant impact on the Port of Baltimore, one of the busiest on the U.S. East Coast. Maryland Senator Ben Cardin told reporters that the reopening of the waterway would be critical for the U.S. economy. The port is a key regional hub for goods ranging from steel and aluminum to agricultural equipment and is used by car makers including General Motors and Honda. Data from the Maryland Port Administration shows the port handled at least 750,000 vehicles last year. This will disrupt vessel schedules and strain handling capacities at other ports, such as Philadelphia and Norfolk, said Mirko Wojcik, Global Director of Intelligence for Everstream Analytics, which provides supply chain services. This could lead to spillover congestions and delays that could last months. Speaking at the White House on Tuesday, U.S. President Joe Biden, who said he'd commute over the bridge many times between his home state of Delaware and Washington, vowed to move heaven and earth to reopen the bridge. We're going to spend all the federal resources they need as we respond to this emergency, he said, and we're going to rebuild that port together. Mr. Biden added that 15,000 U.S. jobs depend on that port. Officials have so far declined to comment on any potential timeline for that to happen. Authorities say that, for now, they are fully focused on the search and rescue operation. Mr. Moore, for his part, said only that the recovery process will not be sure. Baltimore, he acknowledged, was facing a long road after the collapse. This is not the first time the Dali has been involved in an accident. According to Vessel Finder, a tracking website, the ship was involved in another collision in the Belgian port of Antwerp in 2016. There were no injuries or significant damage reported at the time. As night fell on Tuesday, the ship and its load of 3,000 containers remained on the Patapsco River, its nose stuck between the mangled debris of the bridge it brought down in seconds. AP. Here are the big hurdles to the global push to build up renewable energy. The world's governments have agreed they want to triple renewable energy by 2030, a goal laid out at the UN Climate Summit in December. But right now, the post-pandemic global economy is throwing up obstacles that will need to be overcome if the goal is going to be met. Here are the big hurdles to solar, wind, and other renewable energy projects. Costly credits. Central banks in Europe and the US have raised interest rates to combat inflation. That hits renewables harder than it does investments in fossil fuel projects. Renewables have much higher upfront costs to build wind farms, solar arrays, and more, and that borrowing costs money. After that, Operating costs are negligible since the wind and sun are free, of course, but high interest rates have made it harder to get new projects off the ground. In many cases, the answer is raising the agreed price of electricity flowing to the grid to cover added costs. Inflation. Everything costs more these days, not just food and rent, but the electric cables, power turbines, construction materials, and services needed to build wind or solar installations. One exception: solar panels have plunged in price due to massive Chinese production. Snarled supply chains. Order backlogs and supply delays are growing because there are shortages of skilled engineers, raw materials, and a lack of manufacturing capacity for complex machinery needed for renewable energy projects. In order for a new wind turbine or a transformer to connect to the grid, that can take months or longer to arrive than it did before the COVID-19 pandemic. Not in my backyard. So-called NIMBY syndrome remains an issue in many places. Germany's southern region of Bavaria, for example, is known for resisting the noise and appearance of wind turbines in its scenic landscape. Installations have lagged in Bavaria and other regions despite the German government's push for more renewable energy after losing affordable Russian natural gas used to heat homes, generate electricity, and power factories. Worse troubles in developing world. Low-income countries have long faced much higher borrowing costs than the richer parts of the globe because government subsidies or other credit guarantees are uncertain. The result is that the same solar park, if built today, costs twice as much in Ghana as it would in the U.S. because of interest rates alone, according to Todd Moss, a former State Department official who heads the Energy for Growth Hub in Washington. There's already catastrophic hunger in Gaza. Who decides when to call it famine? An international committee of experts issued a dire warning about Gaza this week. Famine is now imminent in northern Gaza and a risk across the entire territory. Yet, they also found that about 30% of the population, some 660,000 people, are currently experiencing catastrophic levels of hunger, meaning those individuals have so little food they are effectively starving. So why stop short of declaring the situation a famine already? And who are these experts that get to decide? NPR spoke with two people working within the web of government officials, aid workers, and analysts responsible for monitoring hunger crises around the world. Here are 5 takeaways. There's a very specific internationally agreed upon system for gauging hunger crises. The process that the world currently relies on to track food emergencies got its start in the 1980s, says Tim Hoffen, Quality Assurance and Methods Advisor on the United States Famine Early Warning Systems network, known as FEWS-NET. In the wake of famines in East and West Africa, aid officials in the United States government decided they needed a way to continuously monitor hunger levels around the world. The idea, says Hoffen, was to provide independent, timely, and evidence-based analysis to help decision-makers prevent future famines. That's what led the establishment of FEWS-NET, Hoffen's employer. It's funded through the State Department's United States Agency for International Development and contracts with the experts outside the U.S. government to collect and analyze data on at-risk locations on a monthly basis. But even after FEWS-NET's creation, there was no agreed-upon international standard for designating the severity of a given hunger crisis. That made it difficult to coordinate with other donor governments and aid organizations on making quick and effective decisions about where to allocate scarce aid dollars. As World Food Program spokesperson Steve Taravella put it, there is a serious need for the aid community to understand the levels of hunger in a scientific, authoritative way, rather than just anecdotally from people saying that is happening here or there. We needed something reliable and authoritative that everybody working on these issues could use as a baseline for moving forward. So in 2004, during a major food emergency in Somalia, FEWS-NET worked with a raft of international partners to develop and fund what's known as the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification Initiative, or IPC. It's a mouthful of humanitarian jargon, but it's basically the authoritative, respected scientific mechanism for measuring levels of hunger in different areas, says Taravella. The IPC has a coordinating office at the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization in Rome, but it convenes special working groups of experts from multiple partners in order to analyze troubled locations on a case-by-case basis. Essentially, says Hoffman, donors wanted a single estimate of need, and the IPC responded to that desire for the consensus around a single estimate. Multiple conditions need to be met before a location is technically considered in famine. The IPC categorizes a given location's hunger level according to a 5-phase scale. FuseNet, which continues to monitor world hunger hotspots on a monthly basis independently of the IPC, uses that scale as well. Communities in IPC Phase 1 are considered basically fine. In Phase 2, people are still generally getting enough food, but the community is considered stressed because a substantial share of its households are having difficulty affording other essential non-food needs. At Phase 3, called Crisis, that's where we start getting nervous, says Taravella. Many households are starting to have trouble getting food, specifically in addition to other basics. They might not have meals as often, he notes. People in Phase 3 may resort in coping strategies that enable them to get enough food in the short term, but at a cost that reduces the resources they can count on to survive in the longer term. For instance, says Taravella, they might start selling off livestock. It's a very uncomfortable period. IPC's latest finding is that 26% of the people in Gaza are in this crisis phase. In Phase 4, called emergencies, these hardships become more pronounced. The gaps in food consumption are even bigger, and people resort to even more dangerous strategies to feed themselves. Hoffman calls them really extreme forms of coping that would help you protect food consumption, but are going to jeopardize your ability to meet your food needs later on. This could include a person liquidating practically all their assets, or in the case of farmers, eating the seeds they would need to plant in order to get food from the next harvest. In Phase 4, the incidence of acute malnutrition and excess deaths starts to rise. FuseNets report places as Gaza as a whole in this phase currently. IPC puts the figure at 39% of the population in Phase 4, with another 30% in the last and highest phase. It's not until a location reaches this Phase 5 that it's actually considered in famine. 3 conditions must be met, starting with at least 1 in 5 households in the area experiencing what's called catastrophe. This means, says Hoffman, that the household is facing an extreme lack of food that would in the near term lead them to face acute malnutrition and mortality. The second condition, at least 30% of children under age 5 are suffering from acute malnutrition based on measurements of their height and weight. Essentially, they start to look skeletal, what's known as wasting. Lastly, at least 2 in every 10,000 adults are dying every day from causes other than trauma. That final measure, notes Hoffman, reflects the fact that extreme lack of food often kills people not only through outright starvation, but by compromising their immune system to an extent that they aren't able to fight off diseases. There's an even higher bar for actually declaring a famine. It's also not enough for either FuseNet or the IPC to find that the 3 criteria for famine have been met. Before they can formally classify a location as being in Phase 5, they are obligated to submit their evidence to a review committee of experts specially convened for the purpose by the IPC. In the case of the latest reports on Gaza, IPC and FuseNet had produced separate, though very similar analysis, and the review committee considered and signed on both simultaneously. Even if a location is found to be in Phase 5, neither FuseNet nor the IPC would make any official proclamation that a famine is underway. It's up to government institutions, United Nations upper leadership, and other high-level representatives to actually make a famine declaration, says Hoffman. Even more famine conditions are officially reached in an area. Many people there may already be starving. The fact that all 3 thresholds must be met before a location is considered in famine helps explain why a large share of the region's people may experience dire conditions well before it officially reaches Phase 5. What's really important to understand is that until famine thresholds are breached, you would still have people dying from hunger or hunger-related mortality, says Hoffen. So in Gaza, you would still expect there to be mortality. And the longer this goes without a solution, the more that we can expect that sort of mortality to occur. Indeed, the IPCC's report on Gaza estimates that in northern Gaza, about 70% of people are now facing catastrophic levels of food insecurity. The report also finds that it is highly unlikely the threshold for acute malnutrition among children has just been reached, and it concludes that unless urgent steps are taken, the death rate will rise above the famine threshold by May. For its part, the Israeli government has played down the hunger crisis in Gaza, with one government spokeswoman going so far as to call it a myth. Other Israeli officials blame Hamas for the chaos in Gaza that hampers aid delivery. Israel has allowed some food aid into the territory since easing a 2-week blockade in October. But aid groups say Israeli measures such as searching trucks for weapons are limiting the number of deliveries and exacerbating the crisis. It's not too late, but time is running short. But Hoffen and Taravella stress that the caveats in their organization's reports are the key here. Both FuseNet and IPC say that if hostilities in Gaza are halted and humanitarian workers are given the access they need to Russian aid, there is still time to avoid widespread famine there. This, after all, is the point of International Famine Classification System, when a location is found to be in one of the higher hunger phases. It doesn't trigger an obligatory steps that government organizations must take, yet the designation is still a powerful tool for mobilizing a response, says Taravella, because it puts the world on notice. Taravella points on a recent observation by his organization's chief economist, Arif Hussein. Several years ago, said Hussein, when famines happened in certain places, you could say, "I'm sorry, I did not know." Today, we see crisis in real time, so we cannot say we did not know. NPR. What is the new etiquette for tipping? What are the new rules for tipping? Businesses that never seemed to ask for a tip before, like grocery stores, self-checkout machines, and fast food restaurants, are now asking for one these days. To answer this question, it helps to understand the purpose of tipping and why requests have increased over the past few years. It's a tricky topic, says Silvia Algretto, a senior economist for the Center of Economic and Policy Research, who has done extensive research on wages and tipping. It's confusing, people don't get it, but it's really quite important to how some workers get paid. While some of our experts say much of the etiquette remains the same, for example, if you're not sure about who or how much to tip, don't be afraid to ask. There are a few new variables to keep in mind. A change in tipping culture. Tipping expectations have grown over the past few years. According to a 2023 Pew Research survey of nearly 12,000 adults in the U.S., about 72% say they are being asked to tip service workers more frequently than in the past. And only about a third say it's extremely or very easy to know when and how much to tip. One of the reasons is the pandemic. We started tipping people we didn't used to tip, and tipping more than usual as a way to support essential workers at a time of crisis, says Shaburanshu Singh, a marketing professor at Johns Hopkins University, who focuses on business strategy and management. At the same time, the technology around how we pay has changed, says Singh. Square, the company behind many electronic payment screen, gets a cut of each transaction, including the tip. So creating software that encourages tipping and encourages big tips means more money for companies like Square. Tipping is also a way to pay workers more without actually raising their wages. It allows restaurants to get more money to workers while still keeping their prices low, says Sean Jung, a professor at Boston University School of Hospitality Administration. Why we tip in America? In the U.S., we have a two-tier wage system, says Algretto. We have minimum wages, and then we have sub-minimum or cash wages paid to workers who are tipped. There's the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour, but every state has the ability to set their own minimum wage. Some states have minimum wages that are more than twice that. There's also a sub-minimum wage. That is a wage some service workers, get paid that is below minimum wage. The idea is that workers earn a sub-minimum wage, and then the customer tips make the difference to get workers up to the minimum wage. Location matters. When deciding how much to tip, it can be helpful to look up the minimum and sub-minimum wages of your state, says Algredo. The think tank Economic Policy Institute has a wage tracker that can help you find this information. The tip you leave for a server in one state might mean something different to a server in another. In Washington State, for example, the minimum wage is more than $16 an hour, and there is no sub-minimum wage for workers like servers. Meanwhile, in Tennessee, the sub-minimum wage is $2.13, so your server is probably counting on the extra change you leave for your pie and coffee. When in doubt, ask. It's not always clear which types of workers earn a minimum and sub-minimum wage. Often, a sub-minimum wage will get paid to bartenders, servers, and people who work at car washes, but it's hard to know. Algredo acknowledges that the system is complicated. It puts way too much on the customer to know what people are getting paid in different jobs in different states. So if you're not sure whether you should tip or how much, simply ask the person who is serving you, says Singh. He shares some helpful questions. What is the minimum and sub-minimum wage in your state? If the sub-minimum wage is low, your tip will help the employee make a livable wage. If there is no sub-minimum wage, tips are actually gratuity. Do you keep your whole tip? Some payment systems like Square take a portion of the tip, so that may be a factor in how much you decide to leave behind. How can I make sure you're getting my tip? Some businesses might not be tipping the person you think your money is going to. If you don't feel comfortable asking these questions, Singh says you can always tip in cash. Then you know you're giving the person right there. The person money right there. Don't forget to tip people who you might not have the direct interaction with, like hotel housekeepers, says Singh. How to deal with unexpected tip requests. If a business you don't expect to ask for a tip is suddenly asking you for a tip, what should you do? It's up to you to decide whether or not you should tip and how much. But Singh likes to leave a 10% tip. If an establishment is asking for a tip, it's often an indication that the workers there are not getting paid a minimum wage. So it's good to err on the side of leaving something. Beware of screen pressure. One last thing to watch out for: screen pressures is Singh. Some businesses load their payment systems with the default minimum tip option of more than 20%. If you don't want to give that much, don't worry about holding up the line to take an extra moment to select the custom tip option. What one horticulturist has to say about pesticide residue on produce. Take a stroll through the produce section at your local grocery store, and you'll likely have to decide whether to buy organic or conventional fruits and vegetables. There's a bounty of factual information about the differences between organic and non-organic produce, in addition to many common public perceptions and misperceptions about which fruits and vegetables are safe and healthy. It can be confusing. Last week, the nonprofit Environmental Working Group released its annual Dirty Dozen list of the produce items containing the most pesticides, according to data from the Department of Agriculture and Food and Drug Administration. Strawberries and spinach topped the list. But Marvin Pitts, a professor of horticulture at Cornell University, says the scientific consensus is that the pesticide residue at government-regulated levels is safe for consumption, and eating conventional fruits and veggies is far healthier than skipping produce at your next meal. It can deter you from eating things that are good for you, Pitts said. Most scientists and people who study this don't think pesticide residue levels come anywhere close to causing harmful toxicological effects on people. Organic versus conventional produce explained. The EWG highlighted the presence of pesticides, including fungicides, in 75% of the conventional produce that was tested. The group encourages shoppers concerned about pesticides to buy organic, even as it suggests that people should try to get more produce on their plate, regardless of how it was grown. Everyone, adults and kids, should eat more fruits and vegetables, whether organic or not, said EWG senior scientist Alexa Friedman. Still, Pitts suggests the focus on pesticides is misguided. The Environmental Protection Agency sets tolerances for the amount of pesticides that can remain on produce sold in the U.S. The Dirty Dozen list only accounts for the presence of a given pesticide, but not the amount that was detected, Pritz said. And experts actually recommend the growers cycle through various pesticides to prevent insects or diseases from developing a resistance to a single one. Buying organic also doesn't necessarily mean avoiding pesticides, since organic growers can use pesticides derived from natural substances. Consumers may also bear some of the blame for the use of pesticides. One example, Pritz said, is that the growers have had to use pesticides on their apples to keep them free of spots and blemishes, because otherwise shoppers wouldn't buy them. So what can I do? Pritz said none of this is meant to dissuade people from buying organic produce, as long as they can afford it and recognize that scientists haven't found any major nutritional benefits. If you buy conventionally grown fruits and vegetables, washing them can help remove dirt and bugs, but it won't remove pesticide residue. The residues are inside the cells, and they're there to stay, he said. Pritz noted that people who get ill from food are often sickened by bacteria, not pesticides. He recommends washing your produce before you eat it, rather than when you put it in the fridge, since moisture in fruit and vegetables can help bacteria and fungus grow. In his own life, Pritz is part of the organic CSA Community Supported Agriculture Program, where he lives. He likes that the farmer uses natural harvesting methods, but says that's not why he signed up. I belong to that not because he's organic, but because he's local, he said. I think that the best thing you can do for the environment is to grow your food close to where you live.